How many times have you arrived at Divine Mercy Sunday with your heart full of good intentions, only to walk away feeling as though something never quite happened? You may not say it out loud. You may not even put it into words, but the feeling is there, that sense that grace passed close by, that you were present, and yet something never truly reached you. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew why, and she wrote about it with a clarity that stings a little, because the truth always stings a little before it sets us free. Divine Mercy Sunday is not simply a date on the calendar. It is a doorway, and doorways are not crossed merely by standing in front of them. There is a distinction that Saint Teresa of Jesus returns to again and again in her writings, too consistently to be coincidence: the difference between the soul that prays and the soul that is disposed to receive, between the one who arrives at a moment of extraordinary grace and the one who arrives prepared for it. That difference is not measured by how many prayers you say or how many years you have been attending Mass. It is measured by something far more interior, far more silent, far more invisible to outside eyes, and yet absolutely decisive. What does the soul need deep within itself so that God's mercy can find a way in? Write the word mercy in the comments right now. Write it as the act of faith that it is, because to speak that name is already to begin preparing. And subscribe to this channel by pressing the button on your screen. Every week we bring you the teachings of Saint Teresa of Jesus that no one ever told you about, the ones your soul has been waiting to hear. What comes next was kept for you, and each part of what you hear depends on the part before it. There are words the Church speaks with a precision that the modern world no longer knows how to receive. Words that sound like ancient liturgy, like Latin, like documents few people read and even fewer study. But behind those words lie concrete realities, verifiable promises, things that either happen or fail to happen in the soul, depending on what the soul does or leaves undone in the moments that matter most. One of those words is indulgence. And Divine Mercy Sunday carries within it a plenary indulgence that the Church offers under specific conditions. Conditions that are not arbitrary, but that reflect a deep understanding of the human soul that Saint Teresa of Jesus knew from the inside, from the very place where theology and mystical experience meet and become one inseparable thing. To understand what is truly at stake on Divine Mercy Sunday, we first need to understand what a plenary indulgence actually is. Not as a concept, but as a reality that touches the eternity of a specific soul. Sin has two consequences that confession does not erase at the same time. The guilt, the rupture with God, is wiped away in the sacrament of penance when there is true contrition and valid absolution. But the temporal punishment, the weight that sin leaves imprinted on the soul, even after it has been forgiven, does not disappear automatically with absolution. It is like a wound that has been treated but still leaves a scar that still hurts, that still limits, that still needs to fully heal before the soul can stand before God in the complete freedom that heaven requires. A plenary indulgence is the full grace of that healing, not partial, not approximate, not nearly complete. Complete. The Church, which received from Christ the power to bind and to loose, offers at certain privileged moments in the liturgical year the possibility of the soul being entirely freed from that punishment. Divine Mercy Sunday is one of those moments, and not just any one among many. The promise attached to that Sunday has a specificity that cannot be overlooked without the soul paying a price it may not even realize it is paying. The Church teaches that whoever on that day, having received the sacraments of confession and communion, prays before the Blessed Sacrament with a disposition of complete detachment from sin, can receive the full remission of all temporal punishment due for their sins, total, without remainder, without any debt left to settle later in purgatory that could be released today, as though the soul was starting again with a cleansing that no number of years of personal spiritual effort could ever produce on its own. This is not a pious metaphor. It is not a beautiful image designed to comfort the devout. It is a doctrinal reality defined by the Church with the full weight of her authority. But here is what almost no one stops to consider with the attention it deserves. A plenary indulgence is not an automatic mechanism activated simply by the physical presence of a body in the right place at the right time. The Church is absolutely clear. The conditions include interior disposition and detachment from all sin. Even venial sin is an essential part of that condition. And that disposition cannot be improvised on Sunday morning while you are looking for your keys and turning off the coffee maker. It is built in advance. It is prepared in the inner life of the soul with a seriousness and intentionality that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught with a precision that no spiritual manual of her era matched, and that very few texts written since have surpassed. And what happens when the soul arrives at Divine Mercy Sunday without that interior disposition? Nothing dramatic, nothing visible. There is no sign, no warning, no outward difference anyone could notice. The soul leaves Mass looking exactly the same as when it entered. Same coat, same face, same afternoon waiting outside the church doors. But the greatest grace that day had to offer passed by without stopping. Not because God withheld it, but because the soul had nowhere to receive it, like trying to fill a container whose opening is sealed shut. The water is real and abundant. The source is fully open and holds nothing back. But the container cannot receive anything while it remains closed in on itself, no matter how long it sits beneath the flow. Saint Teresa of Jesus used images like this with a frequency that was no accident. In the interior castle, she describes with a lucidity that takes your breath away how the soul can be physically close to God, inside the walls of a convent or a church, speaking the right words at the right liturgical moment, and yet remain in the outermost rooms of the interior castle, completely distant from the center where God dwells and waits with limitless patience. Physical proximity does not guarantee interior proximity. Being present in a place of grace does not guarantee receiving the grace. These are two different things, and Saint Teresa of Jesus devoted her entire life to teaching that difference. And here the question opens up that this Sunday truly deserves. The question you may have been wanting to ask for some time without knowing who to ask. Can someone who has been away for years, who is perhaps approaching this Sunday for the first time in a long while, whose heart is still full of unanswered questions, can that person receive the graces of Divine Mercy Sunday? Saint Teresa of Jesus' answer to this question is one of the most beautiful and most courageous things she ever wrote. But to understand it, we first need to understand what it truly means to dispose oneself to receive, and why that disposition is something the soul builds from within, not something that happens to it from outside while it waits. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not arrive at her understanding of interior disposition by an easy road. She arrived by the long road, the one with bends and setbacks, and nights when prayer seems to knock against a stone wall with nothing answering on the other side. She arrived after years of praying without recollection, years she herself describes in the book of her life with a frankness that still surprises readers today. Because Saint Teresa of Jesus did not write about her spiritual life to present herself as a finished model. She wrote to show exactly where the error lay and how much it cost to correct it. And the error she identifies most clearly, the one she says robbed her of nearly 2 decades of genuine interior life, was not a lack of prayer. It was a lack of disposition. There is a distinction Saint Teresa of Jesus establishes in her writings with a firmness that allows no comfortable middle ground. For her, the difference between vocal prayer and mental prayer is not a matter of outward form, but of interior presence. Whoever prays the Our Father with their mind elsewhere is not really praying the Our Father, even if their lips pronounce every word with perfect diction. They are producing sounds. They are fulfilling a form. But real prayer, the kind that crosses the space between the soul and God and actually arrives somewhere true, requires that the one praying be present in what they are praying. Not perfectly, not without any distraction, because Saint Teresa of Jesus knew better than anyone what it is to wrestle with a mind that drifts toward the kitchen, toward the worry of the day, toward the unresolved problem waiting at the end of the rosary, but with an honest intention of being there, of wanting to be there, of returning each time the mind wanders and picking up the thread again with patience and without drama. In the way of perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus spends many pages explaining to her Carmelite sisters why vocal prayer said with interior recollection is worth infinitely more than any quantity of words spoken without it. She does not say this to discourage those who pray. She says it for precisely the opposite reason, to show that any soul, regardless of its spiritual level or theological background, or how many years it has been in the life of faith, can lift its prayer to a quality that transforms simply by pausing for a moment before beginning and deciding to be present in what it is about to do. That moment of pausing, that instant of conscious intention, is the starting point of the disposition that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught throughout her life. But the preparation for a moment of extraordinary grace, like Divine Mercy Sunday, does not begin on Sunday. That is the teaching of Saint Teresa of Jesus that most surprises those who encounter it for the first time. And that makes the most sense to those who read it slowly. The preparation begins before. It begins in the days leading up to it, in the quiet interior of the soul that knows something great is approaching and decides to prepare for it with the same seriousness with which it would prepare its home if it knew a long-awaited guest was coming and it wanted to receive them in the very best way. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this logic better than anyone because she lived it. She knew that great graces are not received by accident. They are received because the soul did something in the quiet of the preceding days that no one saw from the outside, but that God saw from within. What did Saint Teresa of Jesus do in the days before a moment of grace she anticipated as extraordinary? Her writings give us the answer, not spelled out as a checklist, because Saint Teresa of Jesus did not think in lists, but in movements of the soul. Interior dispositions she describes, with images the soul recognizes before the mind has fully processed them. But the answer is there, and it has three elements that appear repeatedly in her texts when she describes the preparation for receiving what God wishes to give. The first is silence, not only external silence, though that matters too. Interior silence. The active decision to reduce the noise the soul generates within itself, the noise of plans, of judgments, of the worries that the modern soul cultivates with a dedication it gives to almost nothing else. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not ask her sisters to stop having concerns. She asked them to place those concerns in God's hands with enough trust that they would stop occupying the center of interior attention during the time of prayer. That shifting of the center, that movement of worries toward the edges so that God can occupy the place that belongs to Him, is what Saint Teresa of Jesus called recollection. And recollection is practiced. It does not simply arrive. It is built in the days before the great moment, brick by brick, silence by silence, decision by decision. The second element will come in the next section, because Saint Teresa of Jesus considered it so important that she set it apart from silence as a distinct thing with concrete consequences for the soul that truly wants to arrive at Divine Mercy Sunday prepared. It is not a minor detail. It is possibly the most difficult of the three elements, the one that meets the most resistance in the modern soul, and the one that Saint Teresa of Jesus described with a directness her sisters still recalled decades after hearing it from her. The second element Saint Teresa of Jesus considered indispensable in preparing to receive an extraordinary grace was the examination of conscience. Not the quick version, the 5-minute review before sleep that always ends with the same list and the same vague resolution to do better tomorrow. Saint Teresa of Jesus was speaking of something different, something that demands more time, more courage, and more willingness to see what the soul would prefer not to see. She was speaking of the kind of examination that enters the rooms that are normally kept shut, that lifts the rugs under which the soul has been quietly tucking things it does not wish to examine, because examining them means having to do something about them. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes this kind of examination with an image that is not easily forgotten. The soul that enters itself without courage, she says, is like someone visiting a large house, but only walking through the front rooms, the ones with clean windows and tidy furniture, and never looking into the back rooms where things are stored that have no other place to go. The soul knows those rooms exist. It has a rough idea of what is in them. But as long as it does not open them and examine them honestly, it cannot truly say it knows its own house. And a soul that does not know its own house cannot prepare itself to receive everything God wants to give, because it does not know what space is actually available or what is occupying the place that should be free for grace. This examination that Saint Teresa of Jesus proposed in the days before an extraordinary moment of grace was not intended to produce anxiety or to weigh down the spiritual life. Its purpose was exactly the opposite. The soul that has honestly examined its interior, that has seen clearly where its attachments lie, where its resistances are, where its quiet loyalties to sins it has not quite let go of have settled. That soul can bring those things to the sacrament of penance with a specificity that changes everything. Not the same vague general confession as always, a concrete confession, one that names things by their name, one that does not hide behind broad categories that make it possible to say everything while actually saying nothing. Saint Teresa of Jesus had a relationship with her confessors that was, among other things, a relationship of honesty that sometimes made the confessors themselves uncomfortable. She named what she saw in her interior with a precision that left no comfortable ambiguity where the soul could hide from itself. And here is the tension this section cannot resolve too quickly, the tension the soul preparing for divine mercy. Sunday must hold without rushing towards an easy answer. Is it enough to simply confess and receive communion? The Church says yes, in the sense that those are the sacramental conditions for the plenary indulgence. But Saint Teresa of Jesus adds something that does not contradict the doctrine. It deepens it from within. She adds that confession and communion received without the interior disposition that supports them are valid, but do not reach everything they could reach. They are the right key placed in the right lock, but not fully turned. The door does not open to its full width. Grace enters, yes, but through a narrow opening, when it could have entered through a doorway flung wide open. The third element of preparation that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught is the most counterintuitive of the three, and the one that meets the most resistance when the soul first hears it. It is not an outward practice. It is not an additional prayer, a fast, or a physical penance. It is an interior renunciation that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes in the interior castle, with words that the devout soul recognizes immediately, but that the will is slow to accept in any real sense. It is the active renunciation of spiritual self-satisfaction, the conscious decision to stop measuring oneself by one's own standards, which are always conveniently favorable, and to stand before God with open, empty hands, without an inventory of merits accumulated, without a list of virtues cultivated, without anything of one's own to offer, except the very disposition to receive everything as gift and nothing as entitlement. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that this renunciation is the hardest of all for the soul that has spent years in the spiritual life. For the soul just beginning, humility comes almost naturally because there is as yet nothing to feel proud of. But for the soul that has been praying for decades, that knows the doctrine, that keeps the precepts, that has built a solid and visible spiritual life, for that soul, the temptation to arrive at divine mercy. Sunday with a certain quiet satisfaction in itself is a real temptation. Subtle, difficult to detect without precisely the kind of interior examination that Saint Teresa of Jesus proposed. Because that satisfaction, however small, however nearly invisible, occupies space in the interior of the soul. And the space it occupies is exactly the space where God's mercy was hoping to enter. The question about the soul that has been away remains open. The question of what Saint Teresa of Jesus specifically did in her own preparation is still unfolding. And the deepest question of all, the one beating beneath everything else, the one the listener has been carrying from the beginning, even if not yet put into clear words, that question also has no answer yet. Because the answer requires entering the very heart of what Saint Teresa of Jesus understood by mercy. And that is what comes next. There is a letter that Saint Teresa of Jesus never wrote, but that her writings contain in full. Scattered across the pages of the book of her life, the interior castle, and the way of perfection, waiting for someone to read them together and understand to whom they are addressed. They are not addressed to perfect souls, not to those who have walked the path of prayer their entire lives without ever stumbling. They are addressed to the exact soul that has been away for years. The soul that feels it has waited too long to return. The soul that carries the weight of that distance as though it were an unpayable debt. One that disqualifies it from the outset from receiving what Divine Mercy Sunday offers. To that soul, Saint Teresa of Jesus has something to say that is neither cheap comfort nor empty promise. It is a truth that changes the way a person stands before God. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes about her own period of interior distance with honesty that is quietly stunning. It was not a visible withdrawal from the outside. She remained in the convent. She continued praying the divine office. She kept to the outward forms of religious life, but inwardly, in her own words, she had stopped seeking God with the sincerity He deserves. She had reached a point where mental prayer felt impossible, and she gradually let it go until it had nearly disappeared from her interior life. And that period lasted years, not days, not weeks, years. And Saint Teresa of Jesus tells it without softening it, without extenuating circumstances, without framing it as an understandable spiritual crisis that anyone might have had. She tells it as what it was, a real loss, a real distance, a withdrawal she chose, even if she did not call it that at the time. Because after that withdrawal, after those years of interior distance, Saint Teresa of Jesus returned. And what she describes when she speaks of that return is not a return made on the strength of personal merit, but a return received as mercy. In her own words, in the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote that God never stopped waiting for her, even when she had stopped seeking Him. That the mercy of God did not calculate the years of distance to determine how much love the return deserved. That the welcome was complete from the very first moment of return. No probationary period, no requirement to demonstrate the solidity of the repentance before receiving grace. This is the answer to the question that was left open. Can someone who has been away for years receive the graces of Divine Mercy Sunday? The answer of Saint Teresa of Jesus, built from her own lived experience and from the doctrine she studied and loved, is yes. Not a conditional yes that depends on the length of the absence. Not a yes reserved for those who can prove their return is permanent. A yes that depends on one thing alone. One condition that Saint Teresa of Jesus called contrition, and that the Church has defined with a precision that leaves no doubt about its scope. Perfect contrition is the sorrow of the soul for having offended God, not out of fear of punishment, but out of love. Out of understanding, even in a brief flash, even in an instant no longer than a heartbeat, that God is good and that sin offends him and that the offense hurts because love hurts when it is betrayed. Saint Teresa of Jesus taught that this sorrow, when it is genuine, erases guilt even before confession, though confession remains obligatory for anyone who has access to it. And she taught something more, something the soul that has been away needs to heal with a particular quality of attention. She taught that perfect contrition does not require an impeccable spiritual history. It does not require years of prior preparation or a track record of faithfulness that would vouch for the sincerity of the present moment. It requires only the sincerity of the present moment, the real sorrow in the real moment, the genuine desire to return in the instant that desire appears. What Divine Mercy Sunday offers the soul that has been away is exactly this: a moment in which the mercy of God pours out with a generosity unmatched anywhere else in the liturgical calendar. A moment in which the soul that arrives with genuine contrition and honestly received sacraments can be freed from a weight it has carried for years, unsure whether it would ever be possible to set it down. Saint Teresa of Jesus would have said, and in fact did say, in different words in other contexts, that there is no distance God's mercy cannot cross if the soul makes the smallest gesture of opening the door from the inside, only from the inside. The door of the soul, as Saint Teresa of Jesus taught in the interior castle, opens only from within. God does not force it, but he waits before it with a patience that has no known limit. And what the soul that has been away needs to know before Divine Mercy Sunday is that opening that door does not require having arrived at any prior spiritual level. It requires only wanting to open it, the honest willingness to take that step, even if the soul trembles doing it, even if it is not sure it is doing it right, even if it has kept the door closed so long it barely remembers how the mechanism works. Saint Teresa of Jesus knows, and the mercy of God, which is what that Sunday celebrates with all the solemnity of the Paschal liturgy, knows too. There is a way of asking that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered superior to all other ways, and it is not the one most devout Catholics practice by instinct. The instinctive way of asking, the one the soul learns almost without realizing it from the first time it folded its hands as a child and looked up toward a sacred image, is the plea born of urgency, the petition that rises from immediate pain, from a need pressing in, from a situation with no visible way out that pushes the soul toward God with the force of desperation rather than the force of love. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not say the prayer was wrong. She said it was incomplete. And in the difference between pleading from urgency and praying from disposition lies a distance that determines the quality of what the soul receives when God responds. In the way of perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus gives extraordinary attention to the Our Father, not as an academic exercise, but as a living school of prayer, as the model Christ himself delivered to teach not only what to ask, but how to be disposed before asking. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus discovers in that prayer, what she points to with a precision that surprises anyone who reads it slowly, is that the Our Father does not begin with petition. It begins with recognition. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Before asking for daily bread, before asking for forgiveness of offenses, before any concrete petition the soul might formulate from its need, there are three movements that orient the soul toward who God is and where the soul stands in relation to him. And those three prior movements, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, are not a formal preamble to the real request. They are the interior preparation without which the real request does not reach everything it could reach. Applied to Divine Mercy Sunday, this has a practical consequence. Saint Teresa of Jesus would have pointed out with complete directness, the soul that arrives that Sunday with a list of petitions, however legitimate those petitions may be, However urgent the needs behind them, that soul is beginning at the end. It is arriving at the banquet and asking to be served dessert before it has even sat down. The preparatory prayer that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught begins with emptying, with setting aside, even temporarily, even only for the duration of prayer, the urgency of what one hopes to receive, in order first to dispose oneself to recognize before whom one stands and what that someone has already done for the soul before the soul has asked for anything. This emptying is not spiritual indifference. It is not the attitude of the soul that says it no longer needs anything because everything is fine. It is exactly the opposite. It is the most demanding act of faith that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught, because it requires the soul to trust that God already knows what it needs before it asks, and that the best way to prepare to receive it is not to multiply petitions, but to enlarge the interior space where God's response can take hold. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the interior castle that the soul that arrives at prayer full of itself, full of its worries, its plans, its urgent requests, is like a vessel already filled to the brim. If God wants to add something, there is nowhere to put it. The prior emptying is not humiliation, but preparation. Not a giving up of what the soul needs, but the intelligent and loving decision to leave room for what God wants to give, to enter without resistance. The difference between pleading from fear and disposing oneself from love is one of the most important distinctions Saint Teresa of Jesus developed across her entire body of work. Pleading from fear arrives before God with the tension of a soul not sure it will be heard, accumulating words as though quantity could compensate for a lack of trust, measuring the distance between what it asks and what it believes it deserves, always finding that distance too great to cross comfortably. Prayer from disposition arrives before God with the stillness of a soul that knows it is standing before the only one who can give what it needs, and that this alone is already enough to be at peace while it waits. It is not passivity. It is a form of interior activity, deeper and more demanding than the agitation of anxious pleading, because it requires holding trust steady without the help of the intense emotion that urgency produces. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this distinction from the inside because she lived it in both directions. She knew what it was to come before God from fear during the years when her interior life was most disordered, and she knew what it was to come from love once her soul had grown strong enough to hold that posture without being toppled by the first difficulty. And what she says about the difference between those two experiences is not an aesthetic preference. It is a description of outcomes. The soul that arrives emptied and disposed receives more. Not because God has favorites, but because there is more room for what was always ready to be given. The interior castle is not a book of theoretical spirituality. It is a map drawn by someone who had walked the territory with her own feet, who knew the shortcuts and the dead ends, who knew precisely where along the path the soul begins to lose its way, and where it begins to see with a clarity that once seemed impossible. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote that map for her Carmelite sisters, but she wrote it with the awareness that the human soul is always the same in its essential structure, that the rooms of the interior castle are the same for the discalcid Carmelite nun of the 16th century as for the woman today who prays alone in her bedroom with a rosary in her hands and a worry she cannot quite release. The map is still valid. And what it shows about the difference between the soul that arrives close to a moment of grace and the soul that arrives open is one of its most concrete and most readily applicable teachings for Divine Mercy Sunday. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes in the interior castle two types of souls she recognized throughout her life of spiritual direction. Not two fixed categories or two predetermined destinies, but two ways of relating to the grace God offers. Two dispositions that translate into two radically different experiences of the same liturgical moment, the same sacrament, the same prayer. The first type is the soul that arrives at prayer with its attention divided between God and everything else. Not because it is bad or because it does not love God, but because it has never made the conscious decision to unify its interior attention during the time it gives to God. It arrives at Mass thinking about what it left unfinished. It receives communion with its heart elsewhere. It prays the rosary while the mind has already moved on to lunch. And it leaves each moment of grace exactly as it arrived. Not because grace was absent, but because the soul was absent from the grace. The second type is the soul that has learned, not without effort, not without repeated stumbling, to unify its attention during prayer, not perfectly. Saint Teresa of Jesus never offered perfection as a condition of entry, but honestly, with the real decision to be present, to return whenever attention wanders, to treat the time of prayer as what it is, the most important moment of the day, the only moment when the soul does the one thing it can do at no other moment, which is to stand directly before God and receive what only God can give. That soul leaves Mass different from how it arrived. It does not always feel the difference. Emotional experience is not the measure Saint Teresa of Jesus uses to gauge the effectiveness of prayer. But something has happened within, something that does not always have a name, but that the soul recognizes with time as the quiet movement of a grace that was received because there was somewhere to receive it. Applied to Divine Mercy Sunday, this distinction carries a particular weight that Saint Teresa of Jesus would have underscored with the full force of her spiritual authority. That Sunday is not an ordinary Sunday, as we have already seen. It is a moment in which the mercy of God flows with a generosity unmatched anywhere else in the liturgical year. And that extraordinary generosity does not make interior disposition less necessary. It makes it more so. Not because grace is elusive or difficult, but because the greater the gift being offered, the greater the difference between receiving it with an open soul and letting it pass with a closed one. The same flowing water that changes nothing in a sealed container fills an open one completely. The difference is not in the source, it is in the vessel. But there is something Saint Teresa of Jesus reserved for the moment when the soul is sufficiently prepared to hear it without confusing it with something else. Something about what happens in the soul that receives the graces of divine mercy. Sunday well, something that does not end on Sunday, something that extends beyond Sunday morning. Something that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes as the natural consequence of having received a great grace with the right disposition. It is not something the soul produces by its own effort. It is something grace produces in the soul when it finds the space it needs to do its complete work. And that something has to do with how the soul holds, in the days that follow, what it received in the moment of grace. How it guards the gift without clutching it so tightly it is stifled, or releasing it so carelessly that it is lost. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that great graces have subtle enemies, not enemies that arrive with force or attack head-on. Enemies that present themselves as legitimate concerns, as necessary duties, as the ordinary weight of life returning in full force on Monday morning, carrying with it an extraordinary ability to make what was received on Sunday seem already distant, already almost unreal, already belonging to a moment of fervor that the soul of the working week does not quite know how to sustain. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that moment, and she had something to say about how to move through it without losing what Sunday had sown. The Monday after Divine Mercy, Sunday is a test that Saint Teresa of Jesus does not name in those words, but describes with a precision that any devout soul immediately recognizes. It is the moment when the elevation of Sunday collides with the gravity of the week, when the fervor that filled the soul during Mass and Communion and the prayer that followed meets head-on the alarm clock, the traffic, the unresolved problem that did not wait for Sunday, to make itself felt again. And in that collision, in that moment when the interior experience of Sunday seems already to belong to another time, the soul faces a choice that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered decisive in determining whether the grace received bears lasting fruit or dissipates like water poured over stone. The choice is not between fervor and coldness, not between continuing to feel close to God or ceasing to feel it. Saint Teresa of Jesus was far too wise in the ways of the soul to reduce the spiritual life to a matter of emotional states. The choice is between faithfulness and abandonment, between continuing to do what the soul knows it ought to do, daily prayer, examination of conscience, brief interior recollection, however imperfect, however unmoved the heart may feel while doing it, and setting everything aside until fervor returns, which is an elegant way of doing nothing, because fervor cannot be summoned at will. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus speaks of faithfulness in times of spiritual dryness with an insistence that cannot be ignored. Dryness, the period in which prayer produces no discernible emotional experience, in which the soul prays and feels that its words are going nowhere, in which God seems silent in a way that weighs, is not, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, a sign of divine abandonment. It is one of the most formative stages of the spiritual journey, because in it, the soul learns to love God without the help of the consolations that make love easy. The soul that knows how to love God only when it feels Him nearby has not yet learned to love Him fully. The soul that continues loving Him in the silence, that remains faithful in practice, when practice yields no immediate emotional reward. That soul is doing something Saint Teresa of Jesus considered more valuable than the most intense fervor experienced under the best interior conditions. Applied to the days following Divine Mercy Sunday, this teaching has very concrete consequences. The grace received that Sunday is not an emotional experience to be artificially prolonged. It is a real gift, deposited in the interior of the soul with all the reality of what God gives when He gives. But that gift needs to be met, not because God conditions His gifts on the soul's response, but because grace works like a seed. The soil it falls on determines what it produces. The same seed in rocky ground and in well-prepared earth yields radically different results, not because the seed changes, but because the soil does. Saint Teresa of Jesus taught her Carmelite sisters that the response to a great grace does not need to be grand. It does not require heroic acts or enormous resolutions that the soul of ordinary days cannot sustain. It requires small faithfulness, the daily prayer, even if brief, the examination of conscience, even if short, the repeated daily decision not to allow the noise of outward life to fill right to the edges the interior space that Sunday opened. That small and steady faithfulness is, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, more fruitful than grand resolutions that collapse within 3 days under the weight of everyday reality. But there is a warning that Saint Teresa of Jesus adds at this point, one the devout soul needs to hear with the same attentiveness it has given to everything else. Graces squandered through lack of response are not automatically recovered. There's no mechanism that returns them to the soul when the soul finally decides to take them seriously. The moment of grace is a moment. It has its time, its window of reception. The grace that finds no response in the soul that received it does not disappear. Nothing God gives disappears. But it may move to work in ways the soul no longer controls or directly perceives, dispersing toward other purposes that divine providence knows, even when the soul cannot see them. The warning of Saint Teresa of Jesus is not meant to produce anxiety, but to produce attentiveness, so that the soul receiving this Sunday receives it with the seriousness it deserves and with the disposition to sustain what it received beyond the moment of receiving it. The soul has now learned what the graces of this Sunday are, how to prepare to receive them, what to do if it has been away for years, how to ask with the right disposition, what difference that disposition makes, and how to guard what it receives in the days that follow. There is one step remaining, the one that turns everything heard into something the soul can carry with clarity and peace. Without the weight of so much knowledge becoming overwhelming, but freeing it to arrive on Sunday with the simplicity that Saint Teresa of Jesus always considered the surest sign of a soul that is truly ready. There is a moment in the book of her life in which Saint Teresa of Jesus describes how she prepared to receive communion, not the exterior rite, the interior movement that preceded it. And what she describes is not a series of complex spiritual acts or a sequence of contemplative exercises that only a very advanced soul could perform. It is something that surprises by its simplicity. It is the image of someone who, before opening the door of their home to an extraordinary guest, pauses for a moment on the threshold, looks inside, and decides with all the honesty they can summon that what is within, though not perfect, is the best they have to offer. Nothing more. Nothing less. Their best, offered with the clean intention of one who knows that the guest does not come for the perfection of the house, but for the love with which the door was opened. That image is the summary of everything Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about interior disposition. And it is the image with which this script wants to arrive at Divine Mercy Sunday. Not with a list of requirements that the soul feels as an additional burden on top of the weight it already carries, but with the understanding that preparing for that Sunday is at its core an act of love. It is saying to God, through concrete and simple gestures spread across the preceding days, that this Sunday is not like any other Sunday, that the soul knows it, that the soul wants to be truly present in it, not just physically, but interiorly, with unified attention and a cleansed heart and open hands, and the interior space prepared to receive what only that Sunday can give. The summary of the steps Saint Teresa of Jesus taught is not complicated once it is seen as a whole. The first is interior silence, cultivated in the days before. The decision to reduce the noise the soul generates inwardly so that there is room for grace to settle. The second is the honest examination of conscience, the kind that does not avoid the back rooms, the kind that brings the soul to the sacrament of penance with the specificity of one who knows exactly what they are carrying and truly wants to leave it there. The third is the renunciation of spiritual self-satisfaction, the decision to arrive on Sunday without an inventory of personal merits, with open hands rather than ones clutched around what the soul believes it has accumulated. And the fourth, which is not a prior step but the movement of Sunday itself, is prayer from disposition, from prior emptying, from recognition of who God is before formulating any concrete petition. These four movements do not require the soul to be perfect. They do not require years of prior spiritual formation or a degree of holiness that few people ever reach. They require honesty, the sincere willingness to try with what the soul actually has at this moment, with its real limitations, its real distractions, its real history, without waiting for ideal conditions that never arrive, because ideal conditions do not exist in the interior of any human soul living in time. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this, and that is precisely why she never placed perfection as the condition of entry into grace. She placed sincere disposition. And sincere disposition is something any soul can have, if it wants to, regardless of where it has been and for how long. The soul that arrives at Divine Mercy, Sunday prepared in the way we have described, does not arrive like someone going to a counter to collect what is owed them by right. It arrives like someone opening the door of their home to the greatest of guests, knowing the house is not perfect, knowing there are rooms that still need work, but with the door completely open and the will completely available and the heart completely turned toward the one who is about to enter. And that guest, who is the mercy of God in its most generous manifestation of the liturgical year, does not look at the imperfect rooms. He looks at the open door. He looks at the real disposition. He looks at the love with which he was invited, and he enters. He enters with everything that Sunday carries within it, with the plenary indulgence for those who meet the conditions with sincerity, with the sacramental grace of communion received in a state of grace, with the particular weight of the mercy that Sunday pours upon the living, and that tradition has always extended, through the communion of saints, toward those who can no longer receive it directly, but who remain connected to those who pray for them. With all of that, he enters the soul that opened the door, and what he does once inside is something no script can fully describe, because it belongs to the silence between the soul and God, the space where the things that change a life happen without making any sound audible from the outside. Divine mercy. Sunday is close. The days remaining before it are exactly the days that Saint Teresa of Jesus would have used to prepare. They are not lost days or waiting days. They are days of interior building, of silence cultivated, of honest examination, of gradual emptying. They are the days in which the soul decides what kind of vessel it wants to be when the moment comes that the source opens with all its generosity. Saint Teresa of Jesus chose to be a completely open vessel, and the story of her interior life is the story of what God can do in a soul that places no limits on what it is willing to receive. You have stayed until the end because something in you knew you needed this. Not abstract information about Divine Mercy Sunday, not one more theological explanation of the plenary indulgence, but this: the certainty that this Sunday can be different from every Sunday before it, if the soul arrives differently than it has arrived before. And that is exactly what Saint Teresa of Jesus left in writing for you. Though she wrote it 5 centuries ago, though she wrote it for a group of Carmelite sisters in a convent in Avila, whose outward lives bear no resemblance to yours, but whose interior lives resemble yours in every essential way. Because the human soul is always the same in its essential structure, the same thirst, the same longing, the same difficulty sustaining attention on what matters most when everything else competes to fill that space, and the same capacity, infinitely greater than the soul believes when it looks at itself with its own eyes, to receive what God wants to give when it decides to open itself to receiving it in earnest. What you have received today is not a list of spiritual tasks. It is a map, the same map that Saint Teresa of Jesus traced from her own lived experience, from her own years of distance and return, from her own nights of dryness and her own dawnings of grace that left her without words, and yet somehow found those words because she knew that souls she would never meet in life would one day need them. Souls like yours, the interior silence you cultivate in the days before, the honest examination that does not avoid the back rooms, the renunciation of arriving on Sunday with hands full of personal merits rather than opening them to receive, the prayer from disposition, from emptying, from recognition of who God is before asking for what you need, and the small, steady faithfulness in the days that follow, the kind that guards what was received without clutching it or releasing it, the kind that makes Sunday not an isolated flash, but the beginning of something that continues and grows and bears fruit in the ordinary days no one photographs or celebrates, but where holiness is truly built. All of that is yours now, and Divine Mercy Sunday is close. The days that remain before it are yours. They are the space that Divine Providence places between this moment and that Sunday, so that you can do with them what Saint Teresa of Jesus would have done. Prepare, not with anxiety or the kind of spiritual perfectionism that exhausts without bearing fruit, but with the quiet steadiness of one who knows where she is going and has decided to arrive well. With the peace of the soul that has understood that God does not ask for perfection, but for disposition, and that disposition is something you can build now with what you have from where you are. But there is something more that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught, something this script has not yet said fully. Something about what the soul receives in moments of extraordinary grace that cannot be kept only for itself. Grace, when it enters a well-disposed soul, does not stay still. It moves. It seeks a way outward toward others. It becomes patience with the person who is difficult to be patient with, tenderness with the one going through something they are not saying out loud, real presence with the people you love, whose quality of attention is sometimes stolen by the hurry and the weariness of daily life. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived this with an intensity that her Carmelite sisters described as almost palpable in the atmosphere of the convent after her deepest periods of prayer. It was not a spectacular transformation. It was something quieter and more real. A person who had been with God and was still carrying Him when she came out of the chapel and found her sisters waiting. That is what Divine Mercy Sunday can plant in your life if you arrive at it prepared. Not only the grace you receive, the grace you radiate afterward. The grace that reaches the people around you without anyone planning it or announcing it, simply because you were with God that Sunday in a real way, and something in you changed, and that change changes something in them without words or explanations. Saint Teresa of Jesus called it the fruit of true prayer, and she said that this fruit is the surest sign that the prayer was real, more certain than any intense emotional experience, more certain than any mystical consolation the soul may have felt during prayer. The fruit in life. The more concrete love with the concrete people of your concrete life. That is what a well-received Divine Mercy Sunday produces. And that is what Saint Teresa of Jesus wanted for you when she wrote everything she wrote. There is more. There is always more when it comes to Saint Teresa of Jesus and the inexhaustible depths of her spiritual teaching. There are dimensions of what you received today that unfold in other directions, that connect with other truths of the Catholic faith that Saint Teresa of Jesus explored with the same precision and the same love with which she explored everything else. There are her teachings on prayer that go deeper still. There are revelations about the soul, about God, and about the relationship between them that Saint Teresa of Jesus left written in pages that very few Catholics have read with the attention they deserve. Not because they are hard to find, but because no one told them that something they needed was waiting there, that something exists. It is waiting for you, and it is in the next video that follows, which was born of the same spiritual heart that produced everything you have just heard. Do not let it pass. What Saint Teresa of Jesus still has to say to you does not fit in a single video. And what comes next is the natural step forward on a path that, if you have come this far, means you have already begun to walk. May Divine Mercy Sunday find you ready. May the days before it be days of well-cultivated silence, honest examination, serene emptying, and a trust that does not need to feel certain in order to be real. May the mercy of God, which that Sunday pours out with a generosity unmatched anywhere else in the year, find in you the open door it has been waiting to find. And may what you receive that Sunday go with you beyond Sunday, into the ordinary days no one sees but God sees, into the small gestures no one celebrates but grace celebrates, into the life that continues, and that from that Sunday forward can continue in a way you have not yet fully imagined, but that Saint Teresa of Jesus already knew when she wrote these words that today found their way to you. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that the Lord does not look at the greatness of our works, but at the love with which we do them, the love with which you prepare in the coming days, the love with which you open the door on Sunday, the love with which you guard what you received in the days that follow. That is what He looks at. That is what counts. And that, thanks to everything you have heard today, you now know exactly how to give Him. Until next time, with all the warmth in the world, may Saint Teresa of Jesus intercede for you today and always.